Okay, so the first thing that I want to do today is talk to you guys a little bit about what the final paper is going to look like. And we still got a little, we've got a while before it comes due. But the earlier we start thinking about it, the better, right? So let me just quickly call up the assignment. And I also, like, one of the reasons I want to go over this with you verbally is because I have slightly changed what the content of this paper is going to be from what is currently on Georgia View. So I just want to go over that with you, make sure everybody gets it, and then I will go in and change the assignment sheet. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is a researched argument. 2,000 to 3,000 words, which is roughly 7 to 9 pages double-spaced, right? So remember, this is going to be a research paper, right? So this isn't going to be 7 to 9 pages you're going to have to come up with out of your own head, right? You are going to be quoting sources here. It's going to be completed in 4 stages, right? So we're going to do this a little bit at a time. The first stage is going to be an annotated bibliography. The second stage is going to be a proposal. We're going to outline what it is you want the paper to be about and what your planned argument is. The third stage is a draft, and the fourth stage is the final paper. So what you're going to do, instead of selecting a text that we've read, what you're going to do is make an argument about some topic in higher education that you're going to do a little bit of research on, right? So this could be anything. Why the hell can you not erase the word? It uses the frickin' green marker too, it doesn't come off.
Take your marker and go over it and then erase it.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just spray something on it later. Okay, so this could be anything from, say, liberal arts education, vocational education, right? Diversity and equity in higher ed, career preparation, athletics, extracurriculars, you see the kinds of things that would be appropriate topics, right? So, like basically any issue in contemporary higher education that you want to write about. This isn't an exhaustive list. These are just a couple of examples. You are going to make some kind of researched argument about this particular topic, right? And we'll do some discussion over the next couple of weeks to help you shape that topic and shape that idea into a viable argument, right? Okay, so the purpose of this assignment is to compose and defend an original argument that is based on research. You are also going to demonstrate familiarity with commonly used library resources and disciplinary research conventions. You're going to compare and contrast secondary sources in building an interpretation of a text, and you're going to learn the conventions of scholarly writing. Right, so that's what this assignment is intended to teach you. Now, in terms of the basic requirements here, right, basic formal requirements are the same as all of your assignments, right? Times New Roman font, 12-point type, all submissions have to be double-spaced, do parenthetical citations for all your sources, and the word count is not negotiable, right? It has to be at least 2,000 words, should be no more than 3,000. Your works cited page does not count towards that total. Any questions so far?
Why 2,000?
Because I'm aiming for something like I said, about 7 to 9 pages double spaced, right? And that is what that translates to. So, your previous paper was about 4 to 5 pages double spaced. So because this is a researched argument, it's going to be a little longer. Any other questions?
Sorry, just curious.
Yeah, and I also do, I do word count, because word count is harder to fudge than page number, right? If I say 7 pages, people fiddle with the margins or with font sizes or whatever, right? If I say 2,000 words, then none of that matters. Any other questions about basic instructions? Okay, so the first part of this that is going to be due is the annotated bibliography. I have put a sample annotated bibliography up in Georgia View in the assignments folder. So you can use that as a model. Has anybody done an annotated bibliography before? Okay, you have.
It was like a while ago, yes.
Pardon?
It was like a while ago, but yes.
Okay, so
Is there like a difference between the works cited and the annotated bib? Because sometimes they're interchangeable.
I want you to use the same formatting principle, so I want you to use MLA format when you're doing the annotated bibliography. But the major difference here is that the annotated bibliography includes a short 5-sentence paragraph for each source, right? So for each source, you write about 5 sentences. It explains to me what the source says and how you intend to use it in your paper, right? And again, you can see what this looks like if you click on what I left in Georgia View. So, things to keep in mind here, right? First off, I want you guys using only scholarly peer-reviewed sources. Does everybody understand what this means if I say only peer-reviewed sources? Okay, you're not even, so what do we mean by peer-reviewed?
Like when you go to, well, I used to do it in my Comp 1 class. We went to Galileo,
Okay.
and then you would have to.
Okay, yeah. There's a way to filter the search
Yeah.
databases, right? And I'll show you how to do that. For those who've not worked with our library databases before, we will go over this.
I also use Google Scholars. That kind of has reliable.
I want you guys using only stuff you get from the library. I do not want you guys just finding sources online, even from Google Scholar. Part of the point of this is to learn how to use the library resources. So I don't want anybody trying to do end runs around that. So no Google Scholar, no online searches, right? We're just going to be using stuff from the library. So what we mean by peer-reviewed, right? So you know how to find peer-reviewed sources, right? But the reason why this matters, right? The reason why your sources need to be peer-reviewed. Peer-reviewed means that experts in the field have reviewed this research and have deemed it to be appropriate for publication, right? What usually happens when you submit an article to a journal, right? The editor takes it, reviews it quickly to make sure it's actually appropriate for this particular journal, and then we'll send copies out to a couple of experts in the field. They will review it, and they will send back their recommendation as to whether it should be published as is, or published with revisions, or whether it should be rejected and why, right? So anything that makes it into a scholarly journal has been through this process, right? And that's one of the reasons why I want you guys to make sure that you're getting your sources from these library databases, right? Because most of what you're going to find there has been peer-reviewed. But it's not, from a peer-reviewed journal, if it's published by a reliable academic press, then that's fine too. Right? The kinds of things I don't want you using, I don't want you using newspapers, magazines, religious texts, books published by commercial presses or internet sources, with the exception of journal articles that you get through Galileo, right? So yeah, you can use the internet. I'm expecting that you will use the internet, but I want you to use the library internet sources, right? And if you have questions about whether or not a particular source is appropriate, right, just ask me, and I'll look at it. So what you're going to want to do in your annotation for each source is describe the argument that the source makes in roughly 5 sentences. Give me the credentials of the author, right? Who is this person and why should we listen to them? And tell me how you intend to use the source in your paper, right? So the basic purpose of the annotated bibliography is for you to show me that you have read the sources, you've thought about them, and you've done a little bit of little bit of checking up to find out who these authors are, right? And sometimes, like the source itself will give you a little blurb that'll tell you a little bit about the author and what their credentials are. Sometimes you might have to, just go look that up yourself, right? And usually you can find that through a quick internet search. Also, when you're using your sources, remember that they don't necessarily have all the answers, and it's perfectly all right to be critical or skeptical of a source. If you disagree with some part of a source's argument, feel free to say so and to explain why, right? So you don't have to just use sources that you agree with or that you think are supportive of your argument. God, that's loud. You can also use sources with which you disagree, right? And we'll talk about how to productively disagree with a source next week.
You can't use the first person though, right?
Here's why we generally try to steer students away from using first person in academic writing, right? There's no hard and fast rule against it. Plenty of published, I've published articles myself that use the first person, right? I think the reason we encourage students not to is because we want to make sure that you're adopting an objective tone and you're not over-personalizing things. And that's easier to learn to do if you're writing entirely in third person than if you're injecting the first person into it. So there's no hard and fast rule against using the first person in an essay, right? I would encourage you not to, because it's going to be easier to be objective if you don't. But I'm not going to say that you can't. Does that make sense?
I mean, it's kind of hard to go against somebody's, if you don't agree with something, it's kind of hard to go against it without saying, well, I don't agree with it.
Well, think of it this way, right? What I want you to, when you're disagreeing with a source, I want your disagreement to be based on evidence rather than a gut reaction. And it's easier to do that if you are merely sort of evaluating sources together, right? Looking at them in comparison to each other, rather than thinking about what your own personal opinion is at the time you're evaluating the sources, right? So one thing that can help with this is think about a broad topic you want to write about first. But before you come up with a thesis, do the research, right? Do the research and weigh the sources against each other, see what they say, see which sides you agree with and why, see which sides you don't agree with and why, right? And that'll help you be a little bit more objective. One other thing I would suggest then, if you're worried about your ability to be objective, choose a topic that is interesting to you, but that does not touch so strongly on, say, your own personal sense of identity that you can't be objective about it, right? And that'll help you kind of keep a couple of steps back from it. Yes?
I have a textbook for my World Civ class, and it
Uh-huh.
has letters from John Locke. Is that about education? Is that an acceptable piece to do the paper on?
I want you guys using the library. So yeah, try not to use things that you already have or that someone else has already given you. Again, like I said, part of the point here is to learn how to use the library databases to do research. So yeah, I don't want people using their own stuff or stuff that they've been given for another class or stuff they find online. I really want you guys to just use the library for this.
Is that a good place to start? Can I write about him then, if that's my inspiration, but go through the library to find out more of his ideas on education?
We can talk about this, yeah. Right now, I just kind of want to lay out the general assignment for everybody. Okay, right, one more thing, right? So your primary source, that is, if there is a text you intend to analyze, does not count towards the 5 source minimum and doesn't need to be included in the annotated bibliography. So only secondary sources need to be included in your annotated bibliography. Now you guys won't really be dealing with a primary text for this, so this isn't really that big a deal. Okay, so any other questions about the annotated bibliography or about working with sources? Yes?
I didn't see it, and I might have missed it if you said it. Word count. Is there?
Word count for the annotated bibliography or for the, okay, there is no specific word count for the annotated bibliography, but what I like, there's a sentence count for each annotation, right? So each annotation should be about 5 sentences long. So give me about 3 sentences to describe the piece and the main argument of the piece. Give me a sentence to tell me how you're going to use it, and give me a sentence to describe the credentials of the author. And that's all I'm going to need for the annotated bibliography. Okay. Any other questions about the annotated bibliography?
So technically we have 6 sources.
Pardon?
Like technically we have 6 sources, including our main text.
Well, I mean, you're not necessarily going to be arguing from a text here, right? You're going to be cobbling something together probably from your secondary sources. So you're going to have an idea that you want to research, right? It's like, I want to talk about, say, the role of diversity and equity in higher education. So you'll do your research on that. You'll gather your 5 to 7 secondary sources. And, you won't really have a primary source there, right? Okay, the proposal is the second part of this. So your proposal is going to have to be at least 500 words long and no longer than 750 words. Right, so what you're going to do is give me your working thesis and a brief description of what you intend to do to advance this thesis in a longer paper. So a couple of things to keep in mind here, right? First off, remember that you're only describing your argument in the proposal, right? You don't have to give me the evidence yet. You're not making the case here, right? All you're doing is giving me a little thumbnail sketch of what you intend to do in the longer paper that I can then evaluate and review, and I can, tell you, where I think you might, productively expand, right? And what ideas might not quite make the cut here, right? So I can give you some direction. Your proposal has to include the following elements, right? So first, a statement of the question you're trying to answer or the problem you're trying to solve. Secondly, your current working thesis, which is going to be your proposed answer to the question you're trying to solve, right? The most important background information your reader will need to understand your argument, and a brief overview of the current state of scholarship on this question drawn from your research, right? So you're not going to be referring here to specific scholars, right? So, Bellamy says X or whatever, right? What I want here instead is just kind of general trends, right? By and large, this is what scholars are saying about this topic, or there are 2 basic schools of thought on this topic, and they are X and Y, right? That's what I want from this, a brief general overview of what scholars are saying about this topic. You don't have to reference specific scholars here. So, any questions about the proposal? And just to be clear too here, right? The reason we're breaking it up into these stages is to make the whole thing a little bit less huge and intimidating, right? You're doing the work a little bit at a time over the course of about a month and a half, and then it's not quite so enormous, right? Yeah, go ahead.
How do you describe an argument? Like, what would be a tip for that? Because you're not making the argument.
No, you're not making the argument. What you're doing is giving me your working thesis, the problem that you're trying to solve. You're giving me the general state of scholarship on that issue at the moment from your research. and you are giving me a little bit of background information, right? That's how you describe the argument. That's what I want from you here. You don't have to tell me yet about process. You don't have to tell me about specific sources. You don't have to start presenting specific evidence, right? You're just telling me this is the question I want to, this is the problem I'm trying to solve. This is my proposed answer. And, the rest of what I just gave you here, right?
Is this when we start, can we ask the question, how we go in our writing analytically, we ask why or what?
Yeah.
And then
Mhm.
later in the paper, we answer those?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like, okay, yeah, I have noticed this, right, in regards to this particular topic. This is what I think's going on and what should be done about it. This is what other scholars think is going on and should be done about it. Here's a little bit of background. And there you go. Proposal. It should probably end with the proposed thesis, right? Just as would be the case with your introduction, right? That proposed thesis is going to be most effective if you place it at the end of the proposal. What's that?
I said a closing argument, sort of.
Yeah, well, really, you're starting the argument there, but yeah, it's an effective place to put the proposed thesis. Okay, so the draft is the third part of this, right? And the draft is going to have to be 75% of the total required length of the final paper in order to receive full credit, right? So for this assignment, your draft is going to have to be 1,500 words to get full credit, right? You will get some credit for turning in anything, right? But you will get 100 on the draft if you give me at least 1,500 words, right? Just as you will get 100 on the proposal if you give me at least 500 words, and just as you'll get 100 on the annotated bibliography if you give me 5 valid sources, right? So each part of this before the final paper is going to be graded solely based on completion, right? Not necessarily based on quality of the work. Although I will give you feedback to help you improve the quality of the work regardless, right? Only the final paper is going to be judged on the quality of the work. So the draft should represent your best attempt at responding to the assignment before receiving instructor feedback, right? So treat the draft like the final paper, and in fact, like the more complete it is, the less you'll have to do for the final, right? Write the best paper you can under the time constraints, right? So when you are writing, remember the following, right? First, that you have to take a position on the issue, right? Do not be wishy-washy. Do not waffle back and forth. Do not say there are multiple perspectives on blah and then not adopt one, right? You have to take a position, argue for the position within the debate you think is strongest. Remember that there are going to be more than 2 possible positions on any issue, right? It's probably not going to be a strict either or. So you may have to weigh multiple different possible arguments, right? You're going to need to quote your sources directly in order to analyze, right? In part because this is what the norm is in the humanities, right? I know in the social sciences, as I think we've discussed, the norm is to paraphrase and summarize. In the humanities, the norm is always going to be to quote. So for this paper, I do expect you to be quoting your sources directly. Now the final paper is going to be due at the very, very end of the semester, right? So the final paper is not going to be due until the 11th of December. So you've got over a month to complete all of this. The big thing to keep in mind here is that your thesis has to be arguable, right? And we talked about this for the first paper, but it bears repeating, right? Arguable means it has to be a proposition that's not immediately obvious to anybody. It has to be supported by evidence from the text and from your secondary sources. And it must be an interpretation with which another reader could conceivably disagree, right? And I've got some advice for you here on how to do quoting. on explaining the quotes that you choose and setting them up. And also, it's best if you remember that the sources that you are reading are part of a larger conversation, right? That they are aware of each other and they are likely responding to each other in various ways, right? All scholars who work within a particular field probably know each other's work, even if they don't know each other personally. So it helps if you can try to imagine what scholar A would say to scholar B's arguments, right? We will do some work on this in class as well, I think next week or the week after. So any questions about the bigger assignment? Any questions about any of this? So this is what the class is going to culminate in, right? There's no final exam because this is a composition class, so there's no point in having tests, right? Essentially, the final test in this course is going to be to get you to think about some issue regarding your own education and construct a research argument about it, right? So let's talk for a second here about due dates then. Just so that everybody is ready for stuff as it comes up. And I have all of this notated. Let me just call it up quickly. I will put all of these dates on the sheet as well. Okay, so your annotated bibliography will be due on Friday the 20th of November. So you got a couple of weeks to think about a topic and find some sources. And in between now and then, we will also talk about what resources you can use to gather sources. Your proposal will be due when we come back from Thanksgiving break. Which is Monday, December 1st. Your draft will be due on Tuesday, the 8th of December. And the final paper will be due on Friday, the 11th. So, like I said, you've got over a month to complete the whole assignment, right? We're going to do this in stages. We're going to talk about each stage as we do it. And these first 3 stages are going to be graded on completion rather than on quality, right? So does anybody have any questions about any of this?
Could we ask for a grade on quality, like a estimate kind of?
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So you'll get a sense of that from the feedback. I think the important thing there is going to be this is what you did right and this is what you did wrong, and this is what you still need to do, right? But yeah, if you really want an estimated grade for it, then I can do that for you, sure.
So in your feedback, you use so what a lot, and I kind of don't know how to do it on the so what.
Okay, so what basically means you have to try to push your reasoning a little further, right? It's kind of shorthand for why does this matter, or why should I care about this, right? It's not meant to sound combative or aggressive. The idea is that, like, I want you to tell me why this is important, right? So if I'm giving you a lot of so whats, then what I need from you is more explanation of why I should care about this particular thing, right? Why this matters, why this is important. Any other questions? Okay, then here's what I would like us to do before we start talking about the John Quincy Adams essay. In part because we are in the midst of an election season. I think these kinds of things are important to think about. I want you guys to briefly consider in writing how education and knowledge of rhetoric in particular can prepare us for civic life. And by civic life, I mean things like voting, political participation, even things like volunteering in your community, right? Anything that has to do with the public life of your community. So just take a few minutes. Remember that you're all going to be expected to share, right? So let that condition what you write. Make sure that it's ready for public consumption. And you are also free to go back through your notes and look at past sources, things like that, right? So just take a little while for this. I will let you know when it's time to stop.
I'm sorry. I keep getting notifications of broken. It's already happened, to be exact.
take about another 2 minutes. Okay, so who is willing to share first? I mean, everybody's going to get called on, so. Yeah, go ahead, Danielle.
It brings you to question not only what others may tell you, but also what you already know. Developmental psychology states that we are continuously growing and changing. However, each individual changes differently depending upon outside influences. Rhetoric sparks in those individuals questions that drive the change, while the answers to those questions is the education that we seek. The final stage is putting that education into action, creating the rhetoric that sparks the questions in others. It is almost a three-part cycle that goes as rhetoric, education, action, over and over again. Without this cycle or process, growth cannot exist. Growth nor the cycle can occur in the improper environment. We must create an environment conducive to growth, an environment that is structured much like the rhetoric that will occur. All of this prepares us to process and execute what we face in daily life, where we must live up to the expectations of others while meeting our own responsibilities.
All right, thank you. So I notice, again, like some very kind of Sun Tzu-like reflection there, but like this sort of reciprocity of all of these particular forces working together, and in particular the notion of putting yourself in a conducive environment for learning. Like I have to say, like I don't know how you guys feel, but this hasn't felt like, this campus hasn't really felt all that conducive to learning to me of late, but I hope that you guys are having a better experience. So who else is ready to talk? Serenity, go for it.
Okay. I believe that the use of education and rhetoric can prepare us for civic life in a multitude of ways. If we are not educated, then we are ignorant. How can we expect to live out a successful life without the basic knowledge that education provides? There is no possible way this can occur unless we rely on the dependency of others to make wise decisions for us. Education and rhetoric should be thought of as vital. By becoming educated on certain topics, we can become knowledgeable enough to know the difference between right and wrong. And with the rhetoric, we can use that education to read through people's behaviors.
I like that last line.
I know.
Yeah, I mean, one important reason to learn rhetoric generally is to hone that bullshit detector. But I think, yeah, I'm hearing some echoes of Douglas in there too, particularly when you're talking about not letting other people make decisions for you. I think, I think that is actually getting at something really important here. In order to participate in civic life in a democracy, right, you have to be able to make informed decisions on your own. And someone in Douglas's situation, for example, right, simply had to rely on what other people were willing to tell him until he could learn to read for himself. All right, Hannah, go for it.
Okay, so I think it's mostly on education because I kind of didn't know how like rhetoric fit in for me.
Okay.
But I just kind of thought that like, you know, in the education system, they kind of need to teach us like more useful stuff for us to be on our own becoming adults.
Okay.
Because I kind of feel like for our generation, we were kind of like babied and everything is kind of done for us and we don't really know how to take care of ourselves.
Okay.
Like, if I teach it earlier on, like we'll be more successful
Uh-huh.
adults.
So what kind of things would you suggest would actually be kind of more useful in your school? And let's open this up to everybody. Like, what do you think would be more successful? Let me rephrase that because my mouth is getting ahead of my brain. Okay, what do you guys think you should be taught in order to successfully participate in the community and in democratic life? Yeah, go ahead.
I've had to learn how to save money on my own and how to do like taxes on my own. Like all of that was adulting is what the
Okay.
millennial group called it.
Okay. So there you go, some of that practical stuff, right? You know, that you're simply like how to balance a checkbook, right? How to fill out your W-4 forms, right? All that kind of thing. Okay, so yeah, that kind of stuff would actually be useful, right? What other kinds of things do you think would actually be useful to learn in school for these purposes in particular?
I don't know, like how to change a tire, like how to change the gas and oil out of your car, well not the gas, but the oil out of your car, how to check your tire pressure, or how to cook and stuff like that, like you said about taxes and
Okay.
stuff like that.
Well, I mean, okay, so I think we're still kind of talking here just like about like kind of like basic life skills stuff, right?
Yeah.
What I'm trying to get at is like, in order to participate in political life or, you know, the life of your community, what sorts of things do you think you need to know?
I feel like the majority of the history we learn is one is to know.
Okay.
It's not really detailed enough so that we can. I'm trying to think of this. Just move on so I can summarize it in my head.
Okay, so we'll let you think about that for a second. But I think I know where you're going. I think I get the general direction you're going in. And like to give you an example of this, like, and how it kind of works out in popular culture. Like I ran across on YouTube an old Thanksgiving special that I hadn't seen when I was a kid. It was made in 1968. I mean, that's older than I am. So, but it was called The Mouse on the Mayflower. And it's a very kind of fictionalized, feel-goody version of the story of the Plymouth landing and you know, the whole first Thanksgiving narrative, right? With no real complications, and nothing goes wrong, and there's no tension between the Native Americans and the new settlers, right? Everybody just gets along and is happy, and there's a lot of stuff about this, like, you know, providing, you know, the, you know, like shaping the destiny of democracy and all that sort of thing, right? So yeah, there's nothing to complicate the narrative. And I think, is that the sort of thing you're trying to get at?
Because it's like, even my sister, she's 14, she doesn't know that, she really thinks that Abraham Lincoln is like a good president. She thought he was a good president. So it's like, we won't know that stuff until we get to college.
Right.
Like even in elementary and middle school, they all have this feel good type of thing where like,
Right.
they want everyone to have the same idea about America and how it's a land of free, home of brave.
Okay. And if multiple perspectives were presented, it would at least help you to learn to think critically about history and about American identity and to weigh those things.
Yes.
Okay. Is that a fair way of putting what you were trying to say?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And I feel like if we were more educated on it, if we were more knowledgeable about it, we could critique the political system in ways where we won't have to go that like that.
Okay.
I want you to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing that school boards have big fights over, right? I will say, like, you know, there is, you know, again, like, I'm a state employee, so I can't make direct political comments about, you know, anything, right? But there is one particular reason why you get the kind of history that you get in school, and it's just one word: Texas. Texas is the largest textbook market in the United States for K-12 textbooks. And so, virtually every textbook in every subject in the U.S. is calibrated to meet the Texas State School Board standards. So, that's a big part of the reason why the way you're taught what you're taught kind of ends up looking that way.
I know some teachers like more that actually how our government works, because like when we watched that Adam and everything video, they thought they knew how the government works. He was like, actually you're wrong, and then they immediately like registered me, and I was like, maybe they are teaching us like what they want us to see, and not like what's actually going on. And I kind of want to know, like, not me specifically, but like what part that we play in the whole process.
And did any of you guys have a civics class in high school? Like required government or civics class?
Yeah.
Okay, and
It was like freshman year though, we were, you know, in the very, very beginning. We didn't really cover that much.
okay. What sort of, do you remember very much of what was covered? I'm just curious because I'm just, you know, this is actually relevant to what we're talking about today, so.
Honestly, I was high most of it.
All right, fair enough. Okay.
I mean, kind of whatever, like, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights and stuff, but then, like, the representatives and how, like, legislation works, like, a little bit.
Okay. So, you know, kind of like the old Schoolhouse Rock, you know, like I'm only a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill.
Each of the houses, like, the legislation and the that's what we're all, how they work.
Okay.
It was like very basic stuff compared to when I took the American government class here. And I feel like it shouldn't have to be like that because in high school I turned 18. And I was getting ready to vote.
I mean, my birthday's in March. So I came of voting age also, you know, while I was still in high school. And most of us, you know, at least if we're born in the first half of the year, most of us do, right? And I think, you know, so one thing I've noticed, and that maybe this does speak to its kind of deficiency in K-12 civics education, is that I've noticed that a lot of students fail American government in their freshman year. That tends to be one of the high failure courses. You probably aren't getting a sufficient civics education in high school. But the reason that I wanted to talk about this in particular is in part because some of the things that we've been reading have kind of been tending in this direction, right? You know, Plato, for example, thought that rhetoric had no real place in civic life because it just led people away from the truth, right? Well, Aristotle argued that because people will tend to naturally choose the true and the just, right? That rhetoric can help actually guide them closer to those principles, provided, you know, it is done by a speaker who knows what they're doing, right? Now, John Quincy Adams is operating kind of largely in Aristotle's tradition, and is in fact trying to make direct connections back to ancient Greece and to the Roman Republic, right? So I just want to parse quickly here the title of his essay. Eloquence is the child of liberty. So, what does eloquence mean? If someone is eloquent, what are we saying about them?
Well spoken.
Yeah, that they speak very well, right? So, when we talk about eloquence, right, we're not just talking about persuasive speech, right? An eloquent speaker also speaks beautifully. there's an element not just here of persuasion, but also of aesthetic beauty. Speech is a kind of art form. Right? The good speech isn't just persuasive, it's also beautiful. And what's the metaphor embedded in this title? Eloquence is the child of liberty.
Isn't the child part, child of liberty? Where
Okay,
it's,
yeah.
Child of freedom?
Yeah, you're
The freedom.
yeah, you're getting on the right track here. So what is the child?
Child is like innocence. I mean,
Pardon?
Eloquence.
Yeah, eloquence is the child. Yes, eloquence is the child, and what is its parent? Yeah, so he's conceiving of these two as having a kind of parent-child relationship, right? You can't have eloquence unless you have liberty.
Freedom of speech.
Yeah, well, that freedom has to come first, right? That before you can have beautiful speech, he's arguing, before you can have rhetoric or persuasive speech, freedom needs to exist already, right? That's the he's setting that as the precondition.
is it kind of going back to like the building blocks?
Yeah, we can also think of this in Seneca's terms, right? Where, the liberal arts don't necessarily bring wisdom themselves, but they prepare your mind to be able to accept wisdom, right?
Was
Yeah.
it the Renaissance period where there were many writers, philosophers that were being in part oppressed by the church, sort of thing? And would that go into that kind of mindset?
Well, there's no particular period in which philosophers have been more oppressed than others. There's nobody society hates more than a free thinker, right? But yeah, I think that you are like most historical societies have been at least on some level authoritarian, right? Particularly in the Western tradition that we're talking about here. We're talking about, after the fall of the Roman Republic, right? Most societies then organized, as kind of monarchies or dictatorships of various sorts, right? And even, religious life often followed similar patterns. If we look at the structure of the Catholic Church, for example, it's basically the same structure that a feudal kingdom in Europe had, right? You have the king at the top, right? King equals pope, and then beneath him are, some barons who are equivalent to cardinals. Beneath them are some dukes or whatever who are equivalent to bishops, and so on and so forth, right? It's the same basic structure. So he's arguing here that you have to have liberty first, and eloquence then comes after, right? And if we look on page 147, right, after he is trying to directly connect this to ancient Athens, right? The most strenuous energies of the human mind, would he say, are always employed where they are instigated by the stimulus of the highest rewards. The art of speaking must be most eagerly sought where it is found to be most useful. It must be most useful where it is capable of producing the greatest effects. And that can be in no other state of things than where the power of persuasion operates upon the will and prompts the actions of other men. The only birthplace of eloquence, therefore, must be a free state. Under arbitrary governments, where the lot is cast upon one man to command and upon all the rest to obey, where the despot, like the Roman centurion, has only to say to one man, "Go," and he goeth, and to another, "Come," and he cometh, persuasion is of no avail. Between authority and obedience there can be no deliberation. And wheresoever submission is the principle of government in a nation, eloquence can never arise. So why is he saying eloquence never arises in authoritarian states?
It's oppressive. They're told what they can and cannot say within the
Mhm.
laws or persecution.
And who makes the decisions in an authoritarian state?
Kings.
Basically, yeah. Basically, as he's saying here, one guy, right? In an authoritarian system, there's usually one guy or one small group, right, that makes all the decisions for everybody. And so, if you want something done in a dictatorship, who do you have to convince?
The people in power.
Yeah, just that one guy, right?
Or the person in power.
Or the person in power or the little club that's in power, right? And persuasive speech doesn't really matter if you're subject to the whims of one ruler, right? Where does persuasive speech actually matter?
Market problems, like actual people, so they can make a difference.
Yeah, like when the people make their own decisions, right? If you have a system in which the people are making their own decisions, then you have to be able to convince the people, right, that what you're proposing is the path they should follow. You have to be able to convince them, to vote for you, right? Or to follow you, or to march with you, or whatever. So, eloquence flourishes in a democracy, according to Quincy Adams, because you have more chance of doing something with it in a democratic system than you do in an authoritarian system, right? It's actually possible, he's saying, to move people to action. Now then he follows here with, right, eloquence is the child of liberty and can descend from no other stock. And where will she find her most instructive school? Will it not be in a country where the same spirit of liberty, which marks the relations between the individuals of the same community, is diffused over those more complicated and important relations between different communities, where the independence of man is corroborated and invigorated by the independence of the state, where the power of persuasion, which influences the will of the citizens at home, has the means of operating upon the will and the conduct of sovereign societies. Should it happen, then, that a number of independent communities, founded upon the principles of civil and political liberty, were so reciprocally situated as to have a great and continual intercourse with each other, and many momentous common interests, occasional as well as permanent, there above all others will be the spot where eloquence will spring to light, will flourish, will rise to the highest perfection of which human art or science is susceptible. So basically what he is saying here, right, is in a society where everyone is more or less equal, that is where the arts of persuasion will flourish, right? That is where eloquence will flourish. Now, we've heard arguments about societies in which everyone is more or less equal before. Have they been this rosy?
No.
What was Thomas Hobbes' argument about equality in society?
Was that like we're not equal?
He was saying that everyone has the same ability to get the same information or something.
Basically, right, yeah, so what he says is that, while we may not be perfectly equal in terms of our particular abilities, right, everyone has particular abilities that help us to compensate for our shortcomings, right? So, say you and I want the same thing, but only one of us can have it. I might be bigger and stronger than you, so I might be able to kill you by force and take it. Right? I'm not actually threatening you, right? We are aware of this, right? But you might be smarter than I am, right? You might be more clever than I am. So you might be able to kill me through guile and trickery before I can kill you by force, right? So what Hobbes is arguing is that equality between human beings simply leads to contention because we can't all have everything that we want. And the only thing that will make us behave is fear of something bigger and more powerful hovering over us, right? So Hobbes is making an argument for authoritarian government. What Quincy Adams is doing is arguing that, in fact, in conditions like the one that's in a state of nature quite similar to the one Hobbes describes, instead the more peaceful arts of persuasion are more likely to prevail. That freedom and relative equality will lead people to use their voices rather than their fists. So I want you guys to consider that for a moment. Think about which argument you think the stronger or the more likely. Do you think in a state of freedom and equality, people are more likely to simply try to persuade each other to do the right thing, or to try to violently enforce their own will on others? I guess where you fall on this depends on how dark your view of human nature is. Yeah, go ahead.
It's the negative aspect. They'll always
Uh-huh.
try to- You will always have the ones who try to force you into it, and
Mhm.
to oppose that, you'll have to become what is oppressing you.
And eloquence can be misused too, right? As it was just basically what Plato was accusing Gorgias of doing, right? Of, you know, teaching people bad precepts. And I think, like, probably what John Quincy Adams might respond to that is like, if you are mitigating our natural impulses with education and with civilization, then you actually can have a society where we do not simply fall victim to our own impulses. That we can, in fact, try to persuade each other using our voices, using our eloquence, rather than using the means of violence at hand. I'm personally not entirely certain whether I agree with him or not. But I think one thing we also have to note is the year in which this was written. Right, 1810. So, yeah, go ahead.
I feel like in a state where the people feel like they have more freedom and voice, they're going to be more compliant than in a place where they're kind of forcing people to follow their rules. Then they're going to be more
Voluntarily
wanting
compliant?
to revolt and rebel against the government and give in to their violent nature.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like the point that I made last week about why I say please on the board, and I don't want you guys looking at your phones, right? Because I want you to comply voluntarily, so I use politeness rather than using threats, right? I'm going to kick you out of class, or I'm going to send you to the dean of students, or whatever, or you'll get suspended or whatever if you don't put your damn phone away, right?
I have a question about that, that's kind of in the line
Yeah.
of this pattern of thought. Is it truly voluntary though? Because it's still a rule set for the class. So it's kind of like, I guess that's...
Well, that's the thing, is that this is kind of what we talked about last time, is it's not really voluntary, right? Because everybody knows that I expected to do it. But you do it less resentfully if I ask politely, right? Than if
So
I...
is that persuasive elegance?
Yeah.
Remember when I would listen to you because you're being polite first rather than you telling us to do it.
Well, there's also
Mhm.
a sense of respect there too, that factors
Yeah.
into it. So I guess to maintain that respect, has that first
Yeah. Well,
persuasive.
sure. And yeah, politeness is often more persuasive than force. But yeah, where was I going with this? So 1810. So let's think in particular to Douglas's piece, and even to Gloria Anzaldua's piece, right? So in 1810 in particular, does everyone in the United States enjoy the same level of freedom? Right? Absolutely not, right? So Adams is also kind of preaching only to a relatively small, limited class of people who have the benefit of an advanced university education. So, he's lecturing to undergraduates at Harvard here, right? So he is still kind of only talking to a small select group. In fact, does everybody know how many U.S. states slavery was legal in 1810?
Yeah, you gotta remember, I wasn't on this planet for American government.
Almost all of them. This is a common misconception, is that the northern colonies were always free colonies, and that the southern colonies were always slave colonies. In fact, the only colony in which slavery was initially illegal was Georgia. And then after General Oglethorpe died, the colonists decided that the colonists had always wanted to bring in slaves, but he was preventing them from doing so. And so after his death, they started bringing slaves into the colony. But yeah, initially across the United States, slavery was
Also
legal.
slave states in the North.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, is that, yeah, this was actually across the country. I think my own home state of Pennsylvania, I think, abolished slavery in 1805, but all they did was stop people from buying new slaves or importing slaves into the colony, right? There were still slaves in Pennsylvania until at least the 1830s. There were still slaves in New Jersey until after the Civil War, right? So this, I think, speaks to one of those historical points you were talking about. Is I think like this was something I didn't know until I was an adult, right? In fact, I was in my 30s when I learned this, because it's not taught or discussed in school. And I think Adams's rosy view of what eloquence can do is sort of coming from his access to, or his membership in a class where this kind of education is common, right? Or he doesn't have to kind of claw for it like Douglas did. And it is 3:15, we're out of time, so we're going to end with that. So next time we're going to be looking at the Audre Lorde piece, and Lorde is talking particularly about intersections between race and gender and sexuality in using your voice in public.